What's up guys, my name is Micah in Praag and today's video is going to be all about time lapses. This will be part of a new series where I want to share video and filmmaking ideas and techniques, as well as share some of my own experiences in the field, especially with cinematography and editing. So if you have been watching some of my videos, you know that I love making and using time lapses. Time lapses undoubtedly make your videos way more cinematic and cooler, and they also are a great tool for transition purposes, you know, sunset and sunrise, day to night and night to day transitions, and they can also be used to show a lot of work being done over time and progress being made. Time lapses are a great tool for your filmmaking and for your YouTube videos, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to do it. So what is a time lapse? A time lapse is made when you shoot a picture in a certain interval for a given duration of time. By doing this, you yourself create a very low frame rate, and when you put these frames into a higher frame rate sequence, then there's going to be less frames shown for a certain duration of time, and it's going to be experienced as a time lapse. I know this is very confusing, so I'm going to explain it further. So to explain this further, I first need to explain the term frame. A frame is the smallest unit of video, also known as a still image or a picture, that together with other frames forms a complete video. Because I don't need to tell you that when a camera shoots a video, it's not really shooting a video as much as it is shooting a bunch of pictures per second that together is going to make a video. So in standard video recording, the camera shoots in 24 frames per second, 24 pictures for 1 second of video. And this is also 24 frames per second in the editing timeline, so that the 24 frames actually make up 1 second. Now the reason why it is 24 frames per second is because it looks most natural to the human eye. It looks most similar to the way we experience real life. Now the frame rate can be manipulated. If you shoot in 12 frames per second, then for every second that comes by, the camera shoots 12 frames. But where it gets interesting is when you have 12 FPS of video, 12 frames per second video, and you put it into a standard FPS timeline, 24 frames per second. 1 second passed in real life, but you have 12 frames instead of 24 frames, which is needed for 1 second of actual video, so you need 50% more frames. As a result, guys, the video time is going to be cut in half, and it's going to be twice as fast because you need twice as many frames. To visualize this in a 24 frames per second timeline, 12 frames would make up half a second, even though 1 second passed in real life. And this is what I mean by a time lapse. Now when we take a picture in intervals, guys, we ourselves create a very low frame rate. For example, if you're shooting one picture every second, then this would be the same as shooting a video in 1 FPS. 1 frame per second. And if 1 second in real life has passed and you only have 1 frame, but you need 24 frames to get 1 second of video in your standard FPS timeline, then your video is going to be 1/24 of the original time. It's only going to be 1/24 of a second, about 4% of the original time, and 24 times as fast. Now you're shooting a picture every single second, and you need 24 frames to get 1 second of actual video. If 1 frame takes you 1 second in real life, then 24 times 1 second is going to be 24 seconds that you're going to have to take to get a 1 second time lapse. 1 second of actual video. And if you want a 5 second time lapse, then 5 times 24 is equal to 120 seconds, and you're gonna have to take 2 minutes to get a 5 second time lapse. Now if you're taking a picture every 10 seconds, you can see that because each frame is gonna take 10 seconds, and you need 24 frames of them for 1 second of actual video, it's gonna take you 240 seconds or 4 minutes to get 1 second of actual video, a 1 second time lapse. And if you want 5 seconds of time lapse material, then it's going to take you 5 times 4 is equal to 20 minutes that you're going to have to take to get a 5 second time lapse. If you're filming something a little bit slower with less movement, then you're better off with longer intervals. And if you're filming like a very busy place with a lot of movement, something like an airport or a city, then you're better off with shorter intervals. So what I do, guys, is I kind of remember the numbers for a picture every 5 seconds and a picture every 10 seconds. And then after I pick an interval kind of based on those, I always calculate how long it's going to take me to get a 5-second time lapse usually, or a 2-second time lapse. And then I set a timer for that on my phone. Now you might be wondering, why would I go through all this trouble and make a photography time lapse when I can just put the camera down, record for a very long period of time, and then speed it up and edit it? Well, here you can see a photography time-lapse versus a sped-up video, and I think that you can see that the photography time-lapse looks a lot better and a lot sharper than the sped-up video. However, guys, I want my arguments to be a little bit more elaborated than saying it just looks better, so here's a few more elaborated reasons, inspired by my own experience, but also by research that I did and an article that I encountered called Beyond the Time by Tomasz Walczak. He gives some really good insights as well, and I'll also put the link of his blog in the description. So the first reason is that you can shoot still images with a higher resolution than video. Tomasz Walczak writes that with DSLR cameras and most other cameras, when you're shooting full HD resolution video, you're shooting in about 2 megapixels. Whereas if you're filming still images, most DSLRs can shoot at least 12 megapixels. He writes, and I quote, "Downscaling that image even to 4K video will increase the amount of detail. Your video will look sharper, and when you're creating movement with keyframes and editing, you can do that way better because you can zoom in and adjust the position without loss of quality." The second reason, guys, is that in DSLRs and most cameras, you can set your shutter speed way lower in photography mode than in video mode. What is shutter speed? Well, shutter speed describes the duration that the shutter is open and that the sensor is exposed to light. The lower your shutter speed and the longer your sensor will be exposed to light, the more light will come in and the more motion blur you will see. That is when you see, literally, blurry movement. The higher your shutter speed and the shorter your sensor will be exposed to light, the less light will come in and the less motion blur we'll see. If you had a video of a moving object recorded in a very high shutter speed and you were to pause the video, then the moving object would look like it was frozen in time. Whereas if the video was recorded in a very low shutter speed and you were to pause it, the moving object would have the motion blur. In video mode from my camera and other DSLR cameras, the shutter speed can only go down to 30. This means a 30th of a second. Whereas in photography mode, I can go down way lower than that. For instance, to 20 or 10 to 5, even 3, a third of a second, which is very long, and this gets a lot of light into the camera and a lot of motion blur. The motion blur can be used for creative effects and really cool time lapses. I've done it before where I filmed like at an airport at a very low shutter speed and then everything is just kind of blurring by. You can use that for creative effect. It looks really cool, but also it can be used as a tool to keep the ISO low. Not to get too off topic here, but the ISO is the light sensitivity. You can brighten your image using the ISO, but you will lose a lot of quality and you will gain a lot of noise and grain, and it won't look very good. Usually in standard video, where your shutter speed is following the 180 degrees rule, which I'll not get into today, you would keep your ISO low by having a lower f-stop or a larger iris size. This is called aperture, and I've talked about it before, how the lower your f-stop is, the more natural light will come in, and the lower your ISO can be. But if you are going for creative effects and you want to get a very, very low shutter speed for a lot of motion blur, then more light will come in because your sensor will be exposed to the light longer, and that's just another tool you can use to keep your ISO low. So the third reason is that it takes up less space, because you're not shooting as many frames as if you were shooting at 24 frames per second. If you were shooting at 24 FPS, then for every second you were shooting 24 frames. Whereas in a time lapse, you're only taking a picture and recording a frame every so many seconds. You are essentially deleting frames, and this takes up less space. Finally, guys, most cameras cannot shoot raw videos, whereas most cameras can shoot raw still images. I will not discuss the advantages of raw imaging today, but just know that it is an advantage for color grading and dynamic range opportunities. Alright, so now that you know what a photography time-lapse is, how it works, and why you should use it, let's get into the tutorial. So to shoot the time lapse, place your camera somewhere on a tripod to make sure that it cannot move. The camera cannot move during the time lapse. Set the camera settings on manual, not on automatic. This might be harder for beginners because now you're in charge of things like the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, but it has to be done to make sure that nothing changes camera-wise throughout the time lapse. The same has to be done with your focus. The focus has to be on manual, not on automatic, to make sure that stays consistent as well. I think it bears repeating that the lighting will change in your camera, but it has to be caused by whatever you're filming, not the camera settings. To actually shoot a picture in intervals, there's a number of ways you can can do this. You can do it manually with a stopwatch. You can just physically take a picture every interval, but that's obviously very tedious, and it would, for obvious reasons, be better to have something that does this automatically for you. Some cameras have this option built in. For some cameras you can download software that can do this, but I and many others use an intervalometer. This is a device that helps you take pictures every so many seconds in intervals, and I myself use the Pixel TW283. It is not very expensive and very easy to use. I plug it in, I put in my interval, and I press record. You obviously need a stopwatch nearby. You can just use your phone for this to make sure you're recording long enough. When we are done recording, we have to put the frames together in our editing software. I myself use Premiere Pro, but the same ideas and principles can be applied to other software as well. I'm gonna sit down and grab my computer and I'll show you how to do it. Alright guys, we are now in my computer. As you can see, I'm in Finder and I've organized my frames into a specific folder. It's pretty important to stay organized, and now we need to drag this folder into our editing software, and for me that's Premiere Pro. But before we can do that, we need to go to Premiere Pro and go to Settings, so press Command, comma, and we have to go to Timeline and make sure that the still image default duration is set to 1 frame. This makes sure that the frames that we're actually putting into our project are actually going to be 1 frame long and not a few seconds, because then it will just be a slideshow and your time-lapse effect will completely go away. And also make sure that you change the setting before you put your footage in, because it won't affect any footage that's already into the project manager. So press OK, and we're going to drag our footage folder into the footage bin in Premiere Pro. As you can see, I've already kind of organized my project manager in Premiere Pro. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this folder and drag it into the sequence icon. Now the reason why I did that is because these images have a different resolution than a 180p video. I've already said that in the beginning of this video, that they shoot in more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave them the way they are, and then I'll export them, and then I'm going to drag them into my project, which is going to be in 1080p. So as you can see, the frames are in the project. Go to the sequence, organize it into our sequence bin, and make sure, because right now the frame rate is 29.97 FPS. Let's go to the sequence settings and change the time base to 24 frames per second. And now as you can see, our time lapse is going. It's hard to see it, so we have to export it first because it's so laggy. But that's kind of the idea of the time lapse. I'm gonna leave the settings the way they are. I'm gonna press Command M. I'm gonna rename the output. So I'm just gonna call it tutorial time-lapse video, and I'm gonna go to match source high bitrate, but I am gonna make sure that we do a few things. We're gonna change the bitrate encoding to VBR2 pass. I'm gonna put this to 30, the target bitrate, and the maximum bitrate to 50. I'm gonna make sure that I select render at maximum depth. Now I'm gonna export. Alright, so we've exported our footage and now it looks like this. And now we're gonna drag this time-lapse, this exported time-lapse, into our main timeline. So what I'm just gonna do is I'm gonna go to footage, create a new bin, I'm gonna do exports, go to Finder, grab this time-lapse, drag it into the bin. And now I'm gonna drag this time-lapse into the main timeline. Keep existing settings, and now as you can see, oh, that's way off. There. You can see that this is way zoomed in, and that's just because this main timeline is in standard YouTube 1080p resolution, whereas this, because it's shot in still images, this footage is going to be way more detailed, so we're going to have to zoom in out, and that's what Tomasz Walczak was talking about gaining detail as you're going to zoom out. So what we're going to do is we're just going to we're going to select our footage, we're going to go to Effect Controls, and we're just going to scale out to make it fit. There. That's 32. Now the reason why I did that is because in the main timeline you can have all your other footage, just pretty much your main project, but also because this is now one video, we can color grade it. So what we can do is we can go to layers, we're gonna make an adjustment layer, we can go to color, and now we can correct the whole thing as much as we would like. So maybe add a little bit of contrast, maybe bring the exposure down a little bit, a little more highlights. And we can also add some movement with the keyframe. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a basic zoom. This is not a keyframe tutorial, so I'm just gonna keep it very, very simple. I'm gonna go to scale, put a keyframe at the beginning, and then put a keyframe at the end. And at the end, I'm gonna zoom it into about 36. And now as you can see, we kind of have a basic zoom. That just makes it look all the more cinematic, but we still have to select both of these keyframes, double click, and go to ease in. This just makes the zoom a little bit smoother. As you can see, it's not as linear, and it looks a little bit better. And that's just kind of how you make a time-lapse. Very simple in editing. As you can see, it looks really cool. This is your main time-lapse. It is usually your main project where you would drag your timeline in. There's different ways to do it, guys. What you can also do is drag all your frames into your main project and then just go about it. But it's always very hard for me to play it back then because it's just gonna lag so much. That's why I like to export it first and then bring it to my main project. But you can pretty much do whatever you want. But what it really comes down to is dragging your frames into your project and kind of assembling them into the time lapse. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was of good use and that you guys gained a better understanding of time lapses. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe to this channel and like the video below. Make sure you post a cool comment and share the video. And I hope I'll see you next time, guys. My name is Micah from Praag. Thank you for watching.